The planet Mars, named after the Roman/Greek god of war, forth from our sun, a frigid desert with gravity 38% the level of Earth gravity, and many secrets still lurking in its frozen rock. This world looms large in the public imagination, thanks in part to the last century plus of many fantastical stories orbiting this alien land. From princesses and Tharks to the inspiration for Arrakis from Dune, and from higher fantasy to harder science fiction, how and why does this crimson circle shine so bright in our sky?
Speculative fiction, like no other genre, reflects the creativity of God.
If you look at the scriptures, you're going to have to see that God uses imagination more than rational discourse.
We are supposed to be image bearers for a vastly creative God.
Reading fantastical fiction opened a portal in my imagination for a place other than just a materialistic world.
I experienced the gospel story with the mind of someone who loved adventure and loved the idea of light conquering darkness.
We're wired for stories that reflect how we see the world in ways that are true.
The story is either pointing to Christ or it's pointing to our need for Christ.
Welcome aboard Fantastical Truth, the podcast from Lorehaven.com, where we explore fantastical stories for God's glory. I am Stephen Burnett, the co-host of the show, publisher of the Lorehaven Mission, future astronaut, and author of the new science fiction adventure launched from Enclave Publishing called Above the Circle of Earth, and I now know where the term astronaut originally came from.
And I'm Zackary Russell, and thanks to the power of AI, this podcast has been automatically translated from Old Solar into English, so you can thank all of the wonderful Harasa and other creatures from Out of the Silent Planet that made that possible and trained the AI. This is episode 253, How Do Classic Sci-Fi Novels Explore the Planet Mars?
You know, we have a hashtag we've been using at Lorehaven, made by humans. I think that also counts if it's made by any sort of sentient life. Just so it's life that God has created. Yeah, whether or not it's Malachondran or whether or not it's Fulchondran, it's people making stuff here. And it's people making up a lot of legends, old mythologies, and newer stories about the planet Mars. And Zach, until I started researching for this episode, I don't think I knew how much Mars in particular has shaped science fiction, right down to the very earliest speculations about the night sky. If it were not for Mars, we would probably not have science fiction as we know it today.
Yeah, it's such a fun planet to consider because you can imagine yourself now that we've got all these images and things back. You can imagine yourself walking there because we've got little robots going around the surface. Whereas Venus, I think they've only landed one thing that was pretty quickly crushed by the atmospheric pressure. And I think that was even a Soviet thing. So I don't even think the US has launched anything there, but just recently there was some kind of planetary alignment happening in the skies. And so we got out our telescope that my mom got us, and we joined her and, looking at the different planets as best we could see them and through the telescope. And Mars really stands out of all the other ones because you can see with your naked eye that it's red. And that's just so interesting. It's just so different. And so you think, wow, what would that be like to have all this red dust all around you at all times? Well, we don't have to imagine too much because here in Austin, we have had a week-long dust storm to almost rival that on Arrakis.
The dust storm blew in literally on Tuesday, March 4th, which was the release date for Above the Circle of Earth. And as I'll explore a bit later, this is not a Martian story, but Mars certainly makes more than a cameo in several chapters of this planet-hopping adventure. And so to get an Arakan dust storm, or at least our best version of it, Zach, on the day was extremely cool. I understand that Dallas got it even worse, but yeah, I was so focused on release day stuff that I really only came up for air in the afternoon and then found out that the air had been charged with all of this dust and the skies were spectacular. Again, it wasn't that bad. It wasn't like, the dust storm in the beginning of The Martian by Ridley Scott or the Arakan dust storms where you see the Shai-Hulud storming out of the desert sea in the midst of it. But it was still pretty cool. So we got a little Martian flavor here in time for last Tuesday. But actually, Zach, it's been the moon, Luna, that's been looming larger in the recent headlines. It was Sunday, just a couple Sundays ago as of release day, that Firefly Aerospace landed their Blue Ghost probe on the moon. And unlike the poor chap that landed a few days later, Blue Ghost landed upright. The visions were spectacular. The video feeds that came back of this thing getting into orbit around the moon and then just slowly settling down. And then the dust was actually shooting so far over the horizon that it looked like it was dissipating because the gravity was so slow. So it was a trick of the eye. And then there's other stuff going on about the moon. NASA still wants to do its Artemis manned moon landing. So we'll.
Oh yeah, they always want to do that.
Another.
Yep.
NASA. I know NASA wants to do a lot of things, and God bless NASA, but maybe they'll have a fighting chance this time. But Mars still got a shout out, actually, in the pseudo-SODU, the kind of State of the Union, but not really, that President Trump gave also on my release day. It was a busy day. And he mentioned, let's put an American flag on Mars. And I've heard presidents say that before, and think what you will of the guy. I at least appreciate the sentiment. I'd like people to get to Mars. I'd like people to get back to the moon. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard. That's something that I think is a God-given impulse to go out and explore space as much as we can.
Or like the other meme I've seen recently, we did this not because it was hard, but because we thought it would be easy.
I don't think anybody thinks getting to Mars would be easy. Everybody now, though, because of Musk's really great viral marketing stunts, everybody automatically thinks about Musk when you think about Mars. The branding is now intertwined, but Mars has been intertwined with the human imagination for much longer than presidents or NASA or Elon Musk or any of these private groups. So that's what we're going to talk about in this episode, which is the second installment of our Martian Month series here on Fantastical Truth. First, however, let's not get whiplash as we switch over from sci-fi to fantasy for our top sponsor today, Enclave Publishing, with a new novel, Fantasy, releasing in just 1 week from author Rochelle Nelson called Ember Gold. Gilda has spent her life isolated in the wild marshlands, a place too wet for the dragon to go. She's safe there, according to her father. So why is he asking her to leave with him now that she has come of age? There is more to Gilda's family than she knows, and debts need to be paid. Betrayed and shattered, she wakes in a crumbling mountain castle with the beast of her nightmares. Except this dragon speaks like a man and reads books. His kindness confuses her and opens a forgotten longing in her heart, all while Gilda plans her escape from a mountain full of secrets. This place can unveil her past and why she was sacrificed to the beast, truths that may put both their lives in danger if they can't learn to trust each other. But how can Gilda ever trust again, especially after she discovers what dragons truly are? Enclave Escape presents Ember Gold, the latest novel by Carol and Christie Award-winning author Rochelle Nelson. Available March the 18th, wherever fantastic books are sold. Ask for Ember Gold at your favorite bookseller or your local library, or order it online at Amazon, or for 20% off the hardcover at enclavepublishingstore.com. You can see that fantastical dragony cover in the show notes for this episode 253, or for the whole podcast archive, go to lorehaven.com/podcast. All right, back from fantasy to science fiction for chapter 1, Early Myths, Glimpses of the Red Planet. We're going to get to the classic sci-fi novels that have explored Mars, but first, where did Mars come from? How did it get there? Well, I have a biblical answer for that. And I think it's the subtext of Genesis 1, verse 16, one of Zach's favorite verses I know. It says, he made the stars also, or in the NIV, he also made the stars. I presume that this includes the planets that are orbiting those stars, just like the 8-ish planets orbit our star, the sun, in our solar system. Every other planet has got to orbit a star that's out there. So I presume that Mars, along with Jupiter, Mercury, Venus, all of those, got created when God made the stars on day 4. So there's all kinds of different godless scientific legends about how Mars got there, coalescing from these spinning gases and all of this. But the Christian and people from other religions who believe in Genesis, they answer Mars was created on day 4. So it's an easy association there. 4th planet from the sun gets created on day 4, along with God's making of the stars from out of nothing. I do believe that he did that only one day, but other Christians can hold different beliefs there. Later on, Mars gets observed by the ancient Greeks and Romans, and because the Greeks had this whole fake god system, their mythology, they named Mars after the god of war, Ares, who of course was soundly defeated by Diana in that fine film Wonder Woman. So Mars loses to Diana, but the planet Mars still lives on. And Mars is, by the way, the Roman version of Ares. As far as I know, they just kind of ripped off the Greek gods and then named them after themselves. So it's the ultimate act of cultural appropriation. Those Romans. Mars and other planets are one of those wandering stars that didn't follow the expected patterns of the sky. They just seem to kind of behave according to their own rules. And so early sky watchers got a little flummoxed about what to make about these wandering stars. And skimming ahead here, till you get telescopes. Finally, folks are able to magnify the sky with these ocular devices and start observing some things about Mars, just like you mentioned, Zach, earlier. And they started seeing features on Mars instead of this little tiny red dot. That means that astronomers were probably, although they probably weren't trying to be, the first writers of micro science fiction. They had to make a little fiction on the way to come up with the things that they were seeing or try to explain the things that they were seeing. I don't see that was done by the first observer of Martian channels in 1877, which is, I hope I pronounced this right, the Italian astronomer Giovanni Schiaparelli. He observed Martian canali, or channels. Then along comes American astronomers like Percival Lowell and others who say, oh, canals. Yeah, we heard you right. Canals are on Mars, and we got little maps of them here. See, and they're all these little straight lines crisscrossing Mars. And the existence of canals on Mars presupposes the existence of Martian canal architects. So suddenly you get this little mythology growing that there are Martians up there on Mars, and they've built canals, and maybe they've built other things, and maybe they have telescopes and they're watching us just like we're watching them. And maybe someday we'll get to meet a Martian, or the Martians will come here, or we will go there. We'll talk about in chapter 2 how people started writing stories about how exactly that could happen.
You know, Stephen, I always wonder why God made other planets. There was this documentary, I guess you call it, series maybe 20 years ago, called The Privileged Planet by the Discovery Institute. And they talked about how all the different factors that had to be in place to make life possible on Earth, especially the fact that Earth is the only place where you can see a solar eclipse in the entire solar system. The sun is 400 times the size of the moon, but it's 400 times the distance. And so it perfectly lines up. And that also allowed us to make scientific discoveries. And it's also just beautiful and kind of haunting. And there's just something very magical about it. Like when we saw the eclipse a year ago. Now, it was just an incredible experience, especially because it was cloudy all day and it finally cleared up at the time of totality. And, Mars, even if we could go there, we could never see an eclipse. And that's just kind of an interesting thought to me. But I often wonder about this. Like, okay, for life to exist on our planet, we needed to have a moon for various reasons. But we also needed to have the gas giants that orbit beyond us, to the comet catchers, as they call them, in all the different ways that they are sort of like the bodyguards of the inner solar system. But you think about, like, well, what is the purpose then of small rocky planets on either side of us? And, I don't know why, but this is just my speculation. I think it's so that we would see that we are on a special planet, that we aren't, it isn't, in other words, God could have just made gas giants and then the Earth, but he chose to make all these other planets. Now, maybe that's what was needed to sort of like stabilize our orbit, or any number of astrobiological kind of reasons that God had to do it that way to make Earth inhabitable. And by the way, I'm drawing here on Isaiah 45:18, which is, I was in a conversation recently about this verse with someone, and it just basically says God made the Earth to be inhabited. Now, people sometimes take that verse to say none of the other planets could be inhabited. Everything else in the entire galaxy universe is uninhabitable. I don't think it says that. I don't know if it is or not. But we know that Mars and Venus are not inhabitable. Not only are they uninhabited, but they can't, like, unless we terraform those planets, there's no way we could live there, at least naturally. And maybe that's to serve the purpose of realizing that God cares about us, that he put us in exactly the right spot. And I think the solar eclipse dynamic really proves that. I think so often when we look at the stars, we're told this story by by secular ideologies that, oh, we're just a speck on a speck and we don't really matter. And this is just one of many planets out there. And I don't think so. Because like the psalmist said, when I look at the sun and the moon and the stars, what is man? You could end right there, but he says, what is man that you are mindful of him? And so I think the purpose of the stars is to tell us something about God's unique relationship with us.
And I think that purpose of the stars is shared by the other planets, our neighbors on either side in other orbits, as you mentioned, Zach. Venus, you can barely get anything there. You certainly can barely land anything there because it's just too hot. It's too close to the sun. The atmosphere is toxic. Like you couldn't even land astronauts there because they would burn to death no matter what equipment they have, at least by technology that we know today or could begin to speculate about. My science fiction world, I don't even do anything with Venus, by the way, because as far as I know, it's just kind of locked away. It's the lava in the video game. You can't go down there. Paralandra made it out to be this wonderful, nurturing place, but that is entirely fantasy. Venus is a no-go. Now, Mars is barely a go. You can survive on Mars, but you got to bring a lot of heat with you. Obviously, you have to bring your oxygen with you. And so it is kind of this reminder on either side of us that it could be way worse, you guys. If I were God, I would put these little reminders in the sky, not just to contribute to that overall feeling of littleness in the vastness of space, but also once we start getting the robots to Mars and Venus, we realize, wow, like the Earth is really unique. Mars, you can barely go there. Venus, you can't go there. What is man that you're mindful of him to give him a planet at just the right space from the sun, with cycles and spinning on its axis and the seasons divided on all of that? What is man that you give him all these good gifts, and including free oxygen and plentiful water, saltwater and freshwater sources? It's just incredible. And fertile soil and everything. Now we don't take it for granted if we know anything about these other places. Mars would take a lot of effort to try to grow stuff there, which, by the way, Zach, I'll talk about in chapter 3, kind of leads in the direction of me questioning what is the financial incentive for getting to Mars, which is something that a lot of science fiction kind of leaves out. What is the ideological incentive? What is the financial incentive? But we can get to that later. A few statistics about Mars, by the way, before we move on. I've just had these in my head for a while because I've spent some time on Mars. Martian gravity is about 3/8 that of Earth, approximately 38%. So it's actually kind of a handy figure there. 38%, 3/8. It's actually closer to, I believe, 0.375. So roughly 38% of Earth. So you could jump really high there if you wanted to, like John Carter does, which is one of the great little scientific facts about the Princess of Mars series that is accurate. Mars, yeah, fourth planet from the sun. As you mentioned, Zach, it doesn't have a moon the size of ours and has two little moons, more like its own little asteroids, Phobos and Deimos, named after the Greek gods Fear and Panic, if I remember correctly. So you got panic from the skies on Mars, which is a little ironic there. And it's frightfully cold on Mars. I don't have the temperature ranges in front of me, but you'd have to bring a space heater for your spaceship. That is for sure. Not only that, but the Martian days are actually kind of surprisingly close to Earth's days. If I remember correctly, 24 minutes longer. So you either got to add like 24 Earth hours, or I forget how many more minutes onto your day cycle, or you just elongate the seconds a little bit and you keep an even 24 hours. And the years are almost exactly twice the amount of Earth. So your birthdays would be halved, halved, halved if you went to Mars, and you'd probably just keep the Earth calendar for Christmas and birthdays and things like that. I'm guessing that's what future settlers would do. Will we have future settlers? I don't know. But until then, we have stories that imagine how people could get to Mars. First, however, sponsor 2, Back to Fantasy for Sunrise Publishing, which is back with the new book in the Blood of Kings Legends series by Jill Williamson. This is where she has a co-author now, Andrew Swearingen, making his debut for the second book in this series, Lord of Winter. After years of darkness, Eric Livna returns from the battlefield, ready to assume his new role as Lord of Saftown. His arranged marriage to Lady Viola has always lacked true affection, but Eric is now hoping to bridge the emotional distance between them. Viola, however, is quietly working on a plan to change things in Saftown, even if it means keeping secrets from her husband. When the ambitious Sir Fenris Yarden stirs up division in Softtown and wreaks havoc on the Livna's marriage, Eric and Viola must decide whether to let betrayal tear them apart or to unite against the forces trying to destroy them. Blood of Kings Legends continues in Lord of Winter from authors Jill Williamson and Andrew Swearingen. This second book in the series is now available in ebook form exclusively at the Sunrise shop. And then Lord of Winter releases in other formats on April the 1st. So you can find those links in the show notes for this episode 253 or for that cool fantastical cover for Lord of Winter. And more info, go to lorehaven.com/podcast for the complete archive. Chapter 2. Zach, I would call the first phase of Martian literary exploration the early myths. Now we move into pulp adventure. This is how man takes his first imaginative steps on Mars. And before I started planning this episode, I thought, like most listeners are thinking now, oh, what was the first popular fantasy novel set on Mars? And we would think of A Princess of Mars, published by Edgar Rice Burroughs in 1912 after the magazine serialization in the All Story magazine. Well, actually, there was another author who beat Burroughs to the Red Planet by 30 years, and that was a chap from Britain called Percy Gregg. In 1880, Percy Gregg wrote a novel called Across the Zodiac, which portrayed a hero's journey to Mars. In 1830, he had a hero who discovered an alternative energy source. He went on a spaceship called an astronaut. It was the first documented use of the term, but it was for the spaceship, not the person. This guy goes to Mars and he meets some tiny little alien beings who don't believe he's from Earth. And this guy, Percy Gregg, is effectively credited for creating the first Swords and Planets style book. He also had probably the first imagined alien language in fiction. So this guy, Percy Gregg, was actually the trope creator. And then Edgar Rice Burroughs, whether incidentally or intentionally, followed in his footsteps onto the Red Planet in 1912. But on the way, we had a few other books. There was a French astronomer and author named Camille Flammarion, who wrote a mystical exploration of the cosmos in 1889, including this imagined Martian landscape. It was sort of a, whoa, space is really big, space is really cool type thing that fired up a lot of imaginations. Then in 1898, H.G. Wells, of course, wrote The War of the Worlds, which didn't go to Mars, but unfortunately the Martians came here and they were not happy with their little tripod spaceships stomping about the UK. Fortunately, they got defeated by a surprise twist ending that a lot of people know.
By Tom Cruise.
Yeah, well, in the modern version of that, yeah, well, they respected the ending there, it was kind of a deus ex machina. That was the era, by the way, getting back to the faith angle. There was a lot of atheistic or at least agnostic assumptions in science fiction. H.G. Wells and people like Jules Verne as well. I don't know whether they're Christians, but they were certainly Victorian gentlemen, and they would just sort of tip their hat in the direction of the divine, a very polite nod, like, Providence has smiled upon us and defeated the aliens with Earth's own native bacteria. And otherwise, the stories are fairly they ignore God, they ignore Christianity, and so you get kind of that origin now in the first science fiction set around Mars of God just being sort of at the margins of the thing at best. Then in 1912,
a watchmaker kind of thing.
Oh, exactly. Yeah,
he set this up millennia ago, and boom, they sprang his trap that he had set. Yeah,
it's a very unitarian. What's the word I'm thinking of?
Deistic.
Well, maybe it is kind of it's a vague deism, exactly, and especially when you get some materialistic philosophy taking off, Darwin's evolution theory challenging everything. So suddenly these early sci-fi writers are thinking, God, okay, maybe he's out there somewhere, but he's not really cool for the stories I want to put together. We don't have people in the War of the Worlds praying against the Martians, to my memory. Which is what would really happen if Martians invaded in the late 19th century.
Well, and there's something else about this too, which I've just started thinking about. Did H.G. Wells write that story to sort of discourage us from going to explore Mars? Because maybe there's Martian microbes that could wipe us all out if we go there. And, there's people that have said, oh, well, because this is set in Great Britain, it's sort of a anti-colonialism type message of like, oh, well, how do you like being colonized, England, you colonizers? We're going to flip the tables on you. So, it's there's so many movies like that afterwards, and stories like all the way to Avatar more recently. So I think there's also a little bit of that in the mix. I don't think that there was any sort of, I mean, who knows? I don't think there's any sort of purpose of acknowledging God's sovereignty over Earth. I think it's more of like a, here's your own just desserts type thing.
Well, it's meant to be, if I remember right when I first read it, it's meant to be a sobering ending. That, okay, we got lucky this time, but maybe next time we won't be so lucky. And it is kind of a materialistic, just a little pinch of mysticism there. Earth can defend itself type thing, which is kind of fun. And that's why it's a famous
Earth can
finale
defend
there.
itself, but not humans. Yeah,
Right.
That's sort of
humans
the angle,
are kind of
right?
helpless. Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so there's a flavor of that in science fiction too, is that space is so big and so wild and so scary that
Yeah.
if we dare to get bold and venture out there, then it's going to push back. And maybe even if we stay here, something's going to come and smack us. If not Martians with their tripod ships, maybe it'll be an asteroid. Remember, Zach, a few weeks ago, there was that scare about the asteroid that had a 10% chance of hitting Earth. And people were starting to theorize about that. And then I think they changed the odds, but it's a good reason to ask those questions. Like, could this
Well, the
happen
odds kept going up,
again?
like day by day. It's like 2%, 3%, 5%.
Right.
And yeah, and you've got people cheering that on, and of course being sarcastic about it. But we have had this very long history, Stephen, of space travel fiction that discourages space travel. And it is interesting to think about a lot of that going back to Wells. That, like you said, space is so big and so terrible and so cosmically, horrible that why would we even think about going there? And then you've got shows where they directly say that kind of thing. And I think Wells is kind of indirectly saying it. And I often wonder, like, what's sort of the rationale? Because again, I know that there is a Christian impulse within certain Christian circles to say, well, Isaiah 45:18 says we shouldn't go to any other planets because God did not design those for us. He only designed this one for life, which, as I said, I think it's reading a little too much into the text. And therefore, any space travel is disobedience to God, and we get what we deserve, from that. And there's sort of a humanistic version of that as well, of like, well, humans evolved for this planet and we wouldn't be compatible with other planets and we should leave them alone anyway. And, there's a very, there's a modern day philosophy in that regard that very much affects like decisions made by NASA of like making sure all of our equipment sent there is decontaminated and not carrying any kind of microbes with it. And then there's debate about when they find these supposed microbes or fossils of microbes. Well, were those just the ones that tagged along, or did that actually come from Mars? There's been this debate for like 30 years, I think.
There's a little of that warning actually from a more biblical worldview in C.S. Lewis's Mars story that we'll talk about in the next chapter. It's interesting to see this more sobering take on space exploration, or even this warning about possible space invaders, the groundbreaking one from H.G. Wells, War of the Worlds, which, by the way, I don't think is specifically about Mars being evil, although he was probably informed by the associations of Mars with the Greek god Ares, the god of war. And so you get this idea, well, Mars is now associated with war. There's going to be some kind of war on Mars, some kind of association there. I think it's just because Mars was big in the news of the day, and it was the closest seemingly inhabited planet to Earth. So let's make the villains come from Mars. Otherwise, Mars has other associations across literature, and it's a fantasy land in Edgar Rice Burroughs. It's a Barsoom with those 10 original Princess of Mars series, the Barsoom series featuring John Carter. It's originally serialized early in 1912 in the All Story magazine. So basically published each chapter, ending with a cliffhanger. And then it was in the fall of that same year that a publisher put them all together and then called it A Princess of Mars. So that's the groundbreaker. Without A Princess of Mars, you wouldn't have Star Wars, you wouldn't have Flash Gordon, you wouldn't have all the other space adventure serials that sometimes include Mars, often do not. Either it's a galaxy far, far away or a galaxy close, close to home. Either way, Burroughs, also famous for Tarzan, wrote at least 10 original Barsoom novels from 1912 to 1941. And then there's 11th book called John Carter of Mars, which also included a lot of work from his son that is tentatively added to the canon. And I've read, I forget if it's one or two of those. I want to read the rest because they are fun. It's I think those books have been described as sort of the elegant trash type original pulp sci-fi genre, where it reads like really highfalutin, but the concepts are very pulp adventure. There's not a whole lot of deep meaning there. It's just fun stuff with John Carter astral projecting himself to Mars, basically because he just really, really wants to. Uh, and then he meets a princess who isn't wearing a whole lot, but he seems just sort of okay and a gentleman about that. And then there's aliens with 6 arms, and then there's a creature that jumps around Mars, and there's battles to fight, and he gets to go in an arena at one point and fight a giant monster, and lots of fun stuff. Like even the whole other planetary gladiator games type thing seems to have found its origin in a Princess of Mars. And there's lots of other pulp adventure stuff there, but the John Carter books of the Barsoom series seems to have leaped ahead of the rest of them in the public consciousness.
Yeah, and what a lot of these books don't take into account is, like you said in the first chapter, the 38% gravity, and what that would affect, not even just in the short term, like being able to jump high or whatever, but the effects it has on the body. And I think we'll talk about that more in chapter 3. But as we've learned more about Mars and just everything in science, it's given us some insight into how it would be very difficult to live there, or at least it'd be difficult to live there long term and then come back. And there's some modern or sort of modern fiction that plays with that, like The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Robert Heinlein. And basically the moon is sort of like a dead end. It's a one-way trip to go to a lower gravity planetary body anyway, because once you live at a lower gravity for a long period of time, your bones change, your muscles change. And then to go back to Earth's gravity is very, very difficult and perhaps impossible. Now, I don't know. I do see that, we've had astronauts that have come back from a year or so in orbit in zero gravity. And it's extremely challenging for them to do that. And so this is one of those things where, okay, we may not be suited for space long term or for lower gravity, at least unless it's permanent. And that's kind of a different thing to think about, because on one hand, I'm like, why does our fiction not have the approach of, like, let's say, the Columbus era of discovering a new world and then just living there? And I'm like, oh, okay, this is a new place to live now. Yeah, because going to Mars would mean permanent changes, most likely. And that's very different than just discovering a new continent. Now, the question is if that's something humanity could be capable of. I got to say, I don't know, Stephen, because, Mars does not have a magnetosphere, for one example. So that's why there's no atmosphere there. And that also means there's no protection from stellar or cosmic radiation. And boy, that stuff could be extremely dangerous after just a short amount of time. And it goes back to it goes back to the Earth being a privileged planet, that we do have a magnetic shield. Now there's people talking about it, the pole shifting and some different changes happening. It's apparently why we're seeing the northern lights further south, because there's apparently some changes happening there. But at least we have it. At least we have that kind of protection. You have none of that on Mars. And so really, to live there, you'd probably have to live underground. That'd be a very different way of living than we're used to, living on top of a planet and seeing the sky.
Almost certainly, barring some other technology that would shield future settlers from the radiation, would you have to live underground. And you may not even be able to live there long term. It may be just a quick mission. You spend a few months or maybe even a couple of years until the orbits line up again, and then you journey back to Earth. But some of these older authors, all of them actually were shielded from this knowledge about Mars. They didn't know all those things about the lack of a magnetosphere. They didn't know much more than the general size and shape and orbital trajectory of Mars. Edgar Rice Burroughs knew about the lower gravity clearly and worked that into the story. And then other stories, my favorite Mars stories, will work that into the story as well. It's not like you get superpowers on Mars because, like you said, Zach, lower gravity means that your muscles and your bones will also atrophy. So That's an issue, but it's not an issue until the later period of Mars fiction, which we'll talk about in our next chapter. First, however, we're stopping by fantasy again for sponsor 3, which is Fragments by J.A. Webb. The world ended, but its masters remained. Actually, this is kind of more like sci-fi, come to think of it. So it's not fantasy, it's sci-fi again. So we get an ally here, although, Christian-made fantasy and sci-fi are all allies anyway. The world ended, but its masters remained. The year is 2158. Civilization has collapsed, but from the ashes, the order has emerged, not as a savior, but as the unseen power that is ruled all along. Truth is a relic. Dissent is a death sentence. Fragments by J.A. Webb is a gripping tale of power, deception, and the courage to seek truth. It's perfect for fans of dystopian thrillers like 1984, Brave New World, and The Da Vinci Code, but with a Christian twist. If you like stories of faith, defiance, and the battle against unseen tyranny, you will love Fragments, book 1 of the Seekers series from J.A. Webb. It is available at Amazon. You can go there in the link we have in our show notes for this episode 253. You can also go to jawebauthor.com. That's web with 2 B's. And for the entire podcast archive, you can go to lorehaven.com/podcast. In chapter 3, we go deeper on Mars. We had the early myths and legends. We had the pulp adventure. But now, going into the 30s, 40s, and 50s, some authors start getting a little more literary, a little more thoughtful about science fiction. Lewis actually was in a conversation with some chaps that's actually documented in an obscure essay that basically transcribes it. And he and the other chaps are talking about, this science fiction is kind of pulp adventure. It's definitely got potential. So they see potential for this genre to grow, to wrestle with some more transcendent ideas, religious and philosophical and scientific, that humans have thought about. So even before you get Mariner 4 in 1965, you've got authors, including Lewis himself, deciding to get a little deeper about Mars. They're using the idea of Mars, not based in science, but to explore the human condition. And Lewis, of course, being a very thoughtful Christian scholar, explored Mars, called Malacandra, in Out of the Silent Planet. And we've already had an episode about that fairly recently, so I won't belabor that here. But that was in 1938. And there were other authors getting into the more literary side, using Mars as the backdrop, like Robert Heinlein, who wrote the boys' adventure novel Red Planet in 1949. This is more of a human-focused story, but he definitely used it, Heinlein did, because he had particular libertarian ideas about how mankind is awesome and we really ought to be free and pursue adventure and all that sort of thing. And as people who've read other Heinlein books, for older readers know, he definitely took that in some very pre-sexual revolution direction. So you can blame some of these sci-fi writers for starting off that nonsense, along with calling for adventure to Mars and beyond. So kind of some mixed ideas in there. Same thing with a guy named Ray Bradbury, who wrote the Martian Chronicles short story series in 1950. A little more artful take on Mars as the backdrop for some bigger questions there about humanity. And then Arthur C. Clarke in 1951. Wow, he's been around a while. He had The Sands of Mars in 1951, and he really got into the terraforming idea. He really wanted to ask those questions. Hey, how could we change Mars, like Zach mentioned earlier, to be more like Earth? And so those are actually some of the ideas that Lewis was wrestling with. Lewis had characters land on Mars who wanted to colonize it for the sake of the glory of humanity, and they really didn't care much for the native Martians. So from a very Christian perspective, not a leftist one, Lewis is asking, hey, aren't human beings still kind of sinful? Is it really wise for us to think about going to other planets for the sake of humanity, even if we have to maybe kill a human or two to get there for the sake of humanity? Well, if so, then what is the point? Then, Zach, this I think where you'll get more interested here, from the fantasy side, moving into the more sciencey side. There's the space race in the 1960s, and NASA sends Mariner 4 to Mars. It does a flyby in 1965, and it took some pictures of Mars and disappointed a lot of science fiction writers, because there's no flora on Mars that we can see. There's no fauna. There's no canals. There's just a lot of desert, a lot of craters, a lot of non-happy places. And suddenly a lot of Martian world building gets blown right up from orbit by Mariner 4. That changed a lot of Martian stories. There's still some of the more romantic ones with more fantasy Mars going forward. But I think that was the turning point where a lot of authors went, well, if we're going to come up with a fantasy planet, we're going to have to think further out beyond Mars. We're going to have to make some up. By coincidence, Dune, also released in 1965, had a Martian-inspired planet called Arrakis that was just a desert planet. Of course, it had spice there and some giant worms and other creatures. But I think that that's where a lot of the imagination that people were fixating on Mars ended up turning in some other direction. And then from here on out, most of the books set on Mars were very human-centered, very science-based or speculative science-based. And you kind of lose a little of that romantic Mars from the books in the decades onward.
Yeah, there is a 2000 era movie called Red Planet, but no apparent connection to the Heinlein book from 49. It's more about astronauts, scientists exploring Mars and finding a bit of a spoiler, but it's been 25 years. This is the Val Kilmer movie, by the way. They find that these microbes essentially are terraforming Mars and changing it. And so you get a little bit of the War of the Worlds type thing where there's just this natural process that that we can't really control that's kind of doing its own thing. Now, the interesting thing is that movie is very much a debate about whether God exists and whether God designed life. And you've got a number of characters debating that. Val Kilmer, interestingly, kind of takes the pro-theism side, or at least the pro-deism side. But he seems to have a theistic view, at least his character does, which is fascinating because that was around the same time that he was in Prince of Egypt. I think that was just before that, maybe.
Oh, yeah, just a couple of years before. Yeah.
Yeah. So I kind of wondered about that connection. Like, anyway, was he going through something? But, that's a very different movie, though, than what came out, I think, right around the same time, which was Mission to Mars with
was that the one with Gary Busey?
Or Gary Busey? No.
Or was it another Gary?
Gary Sinise.
Oh, Gary Sinise. I got it mixed up. That's right.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, and Gary Sinise also for a while was the ride host of Disney's Mission Space ride. I was kind of happy to see him. Of course, he's also in Apollo 13, 1995.
Yeah. Right. So he actually gets to go into space in Mission to Mars. And a very different thing is discovered there, which relates to the supposed face that we've seen from orbit.
They do the face on Mars thing, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's the face, and it's because of ancient aliens, and but also kind of a similar vibe as Red Planet, where it's like man should not go here, and man was not meant to meddle with interplanetary travel, but yet there's this alien mystery to kind of unlock and discover. So it has that similar vibe of like, maybe we should just stay on Earth.
Well, that's more of this tradition then of still preserving the mystery of Mars, but recognizing that just like there may be secrets in the desert on Earth, so there may be secrets in the deserts of Mars, but they're buried deep. Actually, Shannon McDermott's novel, The Time Door, is like that, just released last fall. It takes more of that direction, which I will not spoil. It's fun. Let's just suffice it to say there's still some secrets that Mars is hiding, and they may be a little bit more complex than folks may have anticipated above ground. There's a few of those secrets in some of the early books, some of which I've read in the early 90s that still tried to keep the Mars hope alive. Ben Bova released a novel just called Mars in 1992. He was a science writer, but he did value his human characters too. So I liked Mars. It says it hasn't aged all that great because there's a lot of American-Soviet tensions and relations because it's a joint mission to start the first colony on Mars. And then if I remember right, there are some secrets to discover, but it's a very human-focused story with a lot of the science of its age being wrapped around it. And fairly wholesome, too, as I recall. I read the audiobook, and I enjoyed that one. And then famously, Kim Stanley Robinson had a trilogy, the Mars trilogy from 1992 to 96, Red Mars, Blue Mars, Green Mars, which is about the slow terraforming of Mars and some of the cultural conflicts for the settlers there. I mean, he sent like giant spaceships to Mars. I don't know who's paying for all this or why, but he really got into the math. He really got into what exactly would happen if you dropped this onto Mars from this height at this velocity. And I struggled through Red Mars, frankly. Some people think it gets a little bit more human-centered in the later two volumes, so maybe I'll pick those up. I just remember he had some he had some scenes, or at least some, like pre-fade to black type scenes that just seemed thrown in there just for the prurient interest factor. And I didn't find it all that interesting, but it was formative. That trilogy was formative. And then by the end, kind of judging from the titles there, Mars goes from red to blue to green. And some people still think that you can do that. You can terraform Mars. You can unlock the ice that's been frozen there.
Just got to shoot enough nukes at it, and
exactly,
it'll work.
Blow it up real good, and then hopefully there's no aliens that you're messing with, no microbes that you're disturbing the life cycles of, and maybe we could do it.
Yeah, and there was another movie around this time, Ghosts of Mars, from John Carpenter, horror director, and starring Ice Cube of all people on Mars.
I'm guessing that wasn't an A movie.
No, this was it was a bomb apparently. It has a cult following, according to Wikipedia. So it's about, set in the future where humans have lived on Mars. It's mostly terraformed. And yet there were some original inhabitants that have now possessed the souls of
I hate it when that
these
happens.
people. Right. So it's a little supernatural,
so aliens or demons again.
Yeah, that kind of thing. So, and now contrast this with the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie around this time, Total Recall.
Total Recall. I can't watch it because I'm a Christian.
Yeah. Well, I watched it before I was a Christian, before I was probably old enough to watch it. And very cyberpunk, dystopian kind of society there on Mars. There's really no supernatural angle. There's no, as far as I remember, there's no like Martian life kind of thing. It's just Mars is a harsh place, and punctuated by the famous scene at the end where Arnold's face nearly blows up from the pressure differential, something that's a horrible thing to remember if you've ever seen it. But that movie was really about the human mind and psychology, and this device that could help you remember or forget things, and how everything might be an illusion. And, so it's sort of the unreliable narrator, unreliable everything kind of story. It's a Philip K. Dick story. So of course it's really
weird.
Remember
it for you wholesale. Yeah.
Right. And it's really more about the struggles that his character is going through on a personal level. And it just happens to be set on Mars. There's all these weird things happening there, like biohacking and again, just cybernetics and all the cyberpunk kind of tropes. Mars is just the environment that lets you imagine, all these weird things could happen in our future.
So that may have been why that movie did better, that they didn't put Mars front and center in the title. Whereas, Zach, both movies that you mentioned released in 2000, Mission to Mars and Red Planet, they both bombed. And so there was this perception then, well, audiences really don't care for movies about Mars. I think Disney had a Robert Zemeckis CG animated movie called Mars Needs Moms. It bombed. John Carter in 2012, long stuck in development hell. It was Andrew Stanton, the Pixar director. He'd gone from the oceans to the desert. He really wanted to do a live action movie. And I like John Carter. I think Disney done it wrong. They dropped Of Mars from the title, so it was just John Carter for no reason. A lot of fans wondered why they didn't market this as like one of the formative stories of science fiction. It probably would have done much better if they'd done that. But I think the theory is that Disney had their sights set on Star Wars, and they really didn't care about John Carter. So they just kind of hung him out to dry. Poor John Carter.
And I think those movies bombed because it was such a depressing view of Mars. And maybe it's that, as I was saying, people have just had enough of decade after decade of pessimistic space travel movies that, if we go to Mars, we're all going to die and get possessed by ghosts. So maybe it's just one too many movies like that where we're like, I kind of want to see Mars and experience an adventure there. But it is interesting that the John Carter movie didn't do well. And maybe that's because it's based on this sort of older mythology that we know is not true, that Mars doesn't have a breathable atmosphere, that it has all these things that would kill you, and it doesn't really grapple with any of that. It just kind of ignores that we've learned all of that over the last 50, 60 years. And so that's where I think the Andy Weir book, The Martian, actually solves both of those problems, Stephen, because he very much grapples with, here's all the things that's hard about Mars, and yet it's sort of a hero's journey. It's a survival tale. It's man versus nature. In Total Recall, it's this like man versus himself, and it's kind of weird. And, Mission to Mars, Red Planet, it's sort of like man versus the supernatural, Ghosts of Mars. Those all have kind of tragic endings, but The Martian is the first book and the first movie in a while that's like, hey, man can overcome this. And now, in some sense, it's still the same type of ending of like, well, we don't really make a settlement there. We don't really, do very much with exploring it. We just sort of get by, but it's still a very optimistic take on everything that doesn't, rain on the parade of space travel.
I think that, Zach, that's why I liked The Martian also. It was very much, hey, humans are pretty cool. We can solve problems. And it's not just him, the astronaut Mark Watney on Mars, that he also featured in the 2015 film adaptation. He is besought by all these terrible problems on Mars when he's left behind and they think he's dead, but he's not. And then he manages to solve them all through the power of science and human ingenuity. And then a bunch of people on Earth really get on board the cause of bringing him home. And then I think that's Matt Damon who plays him in the 2015 Ridley Scott movie, and that was the slogan: "Bring him home." So Matt Damon actually does get to come home from another planet in The Martian, which is pretty cool. And the book is great too, but yeah, as we've remarked many times in the show too, yeah, it's full of language. It's absolutely full of language. Yeah. It's kind of fun though that like The Martian, Andy Weir, like he literally started it off kind of with those John Carter roots, the Barsoom roots of the 21st century version of serialization. And then it gets independently published and it just takes off and it breaks a few Martian curses. Suddenly people are interested in Mars mainly for what it means for people. And I'm sure that it's done wonders too for the whole Musk, hey guys, let's get to Mars just to show that we can type thing. Let's make life interplanetary. The stories like that have inspired human beings, but they have also, I think, distracted from some of the very real issues, spiritual and technological, that would restrict Martian exploration. I think, Zach, maybe that's why maybe the most popular series now, I've heard you mention it several times, is the Red Rising series from Pierce Brown that started in 2014. There's a new one coming out this year, am I right? And it's more far future version of Mars with a lot of the politics and stuff with Mars at the center of it.
Oh, yeah. It's so I think book 7, which I read was called Red God, is supposed to be coming out soon. I've read the first 3. And yeah, it's Mars hundreds of years in the future, a totally unrecognizable planet and society. I don't know how much to go into spoilers or whatever, but it sort of hand waves a lot of the issues that we've talked about with surviving on Mars and terraforming and all that kind of stuff. And it's very much like a man versus society story. So again, Mars is just sort of the backdrop for this larger battle that's happening within the solar system and starting on Mars. And maybe that's what makes it fun, is like you don't worry so much about the atmosphere or the magnetosphere or the gravity or the whatever, the sunlight. It's just there's all these other things that are going on, just this very human battle that's happening. And in a similar way, the Expanse is in that started about the same time as Red Rising, or maybe even a little before it. But the Expanse is like, hey, what if we colonize the whole solar system? But again, it's sort of this cyberpunk world where there's still all of these same problems that we've had. That there's different classes essentially of society. There's an underclass, and then what if we just throw aliens into it and kind of bring up that whole thing? And yeah, it's Mars, but like there's underground colonies, there's dome colonies, there's this terraforming project, there's Martian Marines, there's interplanetary battles between Earth and Mars, and then between Earth, Mars, and the Belters, and then the aliens. And so, yeah, it's again, you're focused more on all of these different conflicts than the direct conflict with the planet itself. And so, like Red Rising, it takes you beyond, what would it be like to try to survive on Mars to, well, what if you also had all these other problems going on? And I think those stories just do a little bit better because it's like, okay, here's the good, the bad, and the ugly of space travel and planetary colonization. And it's not like questioning, should we do this exactly? It's just like, okay, how would this play out? And what are all the different things that would happen on a societal level if we did this? And okay, and you get you get good and bad things from it, but it's not a total negative about going into space.
I see Mars as a microcosm of this deep human impulse that is, I think, universal to all these different kinds of stories about Mars, whether they are the pulp adventure or the more softer science fiction or the harder science fiction, whether it's near future, far future, whatever. And I think this is encapsulated by this idea in the original Burroughs in 1912 of John Carter just sort of projecting himself to Mars. There's a scene, it's kind of in the movie, but in the movie, it's more of like, no, he actually goes there. But in the book, he just really thinks Mars looks very, very cool. I'm probably simplifying this a little bit. And he just thinks very hard in this sort of mystical consciousness transference. He projects himself to Mars while his body is still on Earth. And yet he's on Mars and he's having adventures and all this. I think that is a stand-in for humans now seeing Mars, this actual other world in the sky. It's not Narnia, it's not Middle Earth, it's not some fantasy world that we could never get to except by magic. Mars is actually there, whether it's a desert or it's some older version of Mars that's full of civilizations and plants and animals and stuff. It's real. God made it. It's in our sky. We can see it. And so humans now project our human sins and aspirations and ideas onto Mars. It's a reflection for Earth, similar to how the moon is a reflection for the sun's light. And so we can't help but think, hey, what would we like to go there? Could we make another version of Earth there? Could we terraform it? Should we not terraform it? Are we going to find secrets below the surface? Is Mars going to give us purpose? Can this other world say something about our world that helps us become better as humans or as humanity? And so I think that may be another reason God has put Mars there. It is a reflection of us. Any other fictional world or real world is a reflection of us. And therefore reflects how God made us, just like we reflect God. We cast our imaginations onto Mars. We put our probes on the surface. We make plans to go there for real someday and put flags into the dirt. And then in either case, we're going to bring our sins with us, like Lewis supposed, or we bring our aspirations with us. And the big question I have at the end is why? Why would we want to do that? Who's paying for all this? And a lot of sci-fi writers go, well, Earth gets overpopulated, global warming, you have to wreck Earth in your imagination in order to make Mars more appealing, because otherwise it's better the devil planet than the one where you've barely built anything. So you got to have some purpose for going to Mars. And in my novel, Above the Circle of Earth, the purpose is mainly ideological. There's a lot of funding in order to get a new frontier. And going back to the past, it's fascinating to see that the Mars stories really took off right about the tail end of the settlement of the American Western frontier. People really had this exploration impulse, and now they had nowhere to put it. Everywhere had basically been explored, and the towns had sprung up, and everything was getting domesticated. So the wild Western man needed to go somewhere to work things out. Well, Mars was the next Wild West, and I think that that's kind of held true now. We got to go explore something. We got to go settle places. It's just a little harder to do that on Mars because there is like no natural resources unless you bring a lot of technology with you, or there's some other changes with terraforming. So I think the Mars stories will continue. The old romantic versions may come back for a while, but I think it's going to be fairly shaped by the constraints of what we know about the planet. And as we keep landing probes there, or maybe even eventually land boots into the regolith within our lifetimes, Zach, we're going to get some fascinating Mars stories to come, hopefully ones that bring glory to God one way or another, whether they are the fictional stories that people create or the real life Martian adventure stories that we're going to see in our real time.
Well, to you, our listener, we want to know, what is your favorite planet, whether in science fiction or the real world, or some other totally made up planet? Is it Mars? Is it Venus? One of the other planets in our solar system? Is it Pluto? I haven't read much fiction or know much about Pluto in fiction.
It's just an asteroid now. I'm sorry.
Right.
Got demoted.
That's a trick question.
Poor
It's not a
performance.
planet. Or is it some other planet, some other star system? So send us a note to podcast@lorehaven.com, or find us on any social media channel, or leave us a note on the episode page. Let us know your favorite planet. And now we've got a giveaway. So we've got the prize wheel all ready to go. So Stephen, tell us about the prize we're giving away today.
This is for the ACE launch day giveaway. We announced it last week for episode 252 about my novel, Above the Circle of Earth. And so for all these entries for a one blessed winner, I'm making available a signed hardcover version of the book, plus a Lego spaceship that your kids can build or you can build when no one's looking, or you can give it away to someone you know. I'm also going to include some other swag in there, a space mission emblem badge and some other cool stuff. So I've got the wheel ready to go, and let's see who's going to be the blessed winner now. This is hopefully not someone who's won recently, although I saw a lot of new people sharing this stuff. And the winner is, it just edged over into the green, and the winner is at Deborah O'Carroll on Instagram. She's going to win this stuff, which I will get bundled up as soon as possible and send that over to you. Deborah, thank you so much for listening to this episode, for sharing this episode, and for being a fantastic supporter of the Lorehaven mission. So is our listener, Zach Hindes, I hope I pronounced your name right, who wrote in a comment about the Vibe Shift episode we did, episode 251, about how the general audience is kind of turned from what Christians may have thought it was into a more culturally conservative audience. Zach wrote on X, been thinking in this for a couple of years now, and have certainly felt a shift in the churches and circles I run in, saying much of the same thing, definitely online as well. Zach, you and I could have gone into that even more for our discussion about how Mars does have this kind of libertarian streak about it. You know, that's because of that whole frontier experience of the lone man going to Mars. But then you also have this kind of collective streak to it, like even in Ben Bova's book Mars, of Mars is going to be this symbol of international cooperation, and the Americans and the Soviets are going to stop fighting, and now they're going to put together this joint settlement on another world. Just like people will project their spiritual impulses and their technological desires onto Mars, we're gonna cast a lot of political notions onto the planet too, and I've no doubt that's going to continue even more, because a lot of Mars stories, probably because of the name, end up very masculine, traditionally masculine in flavor. And there's some good elements to that as well as some bad elements.
Yeah, I keep wondering how in the real world we will see more or less of an impulse to travel to Mars because of the cultural vibe shifts that are going on. Like, are we going to see groups of people say, you know what, we've tried to put up with this political restriction or religious infringement, and we just can't anymore. And there's nowhere else to go on Earth, so we're going to go to Mars. We're going to sail on the Mayflower 2 or whatever, and just go build our own settlement there, do our own thing. Or will the political conflicts sort of die down a little bit, and we can work through whatever the differences are? But yeah, I mean, there are some things that have changed here, but I recognize it's not everywhere around the world, and there's even in some English-speaking countries, Stephen, there are Christians living with much worse restrictions on their religious freedom. In the UK, for example, you can't even pray in public for certain topics in certain areas. Are we going to see some kind of exodus of Christians, or of, like you said, libertarians or other just kind of political exiles that want to build something new? Now, obviously, they'll have to go through all of the challenges that we've talked about scientifically to do that. But Mars definitely appeals for all of those reasons. It's like it's a place to start over. It's a new frontier. It's a new Wild West. And I like how you've played with that in your book, and how it won't quite be as simple maybe as people think it would be, because there's going to be a lot of competing factions, I think, that will want to go there in the real world.
I think that one way or another, Zach, will bring the Martian associations with war to the real world, because humans are just going to bring their own conflicts there. And just because it happens to be the closest neighbor and it happens to be named after the Greek god of war, I have no doubt that that's going to enhance those impulses even more. So it's going to be interesting to watch, hopefully from a safe position on Earth. But that's why I said at the top of the show, Zach, I'm a future astronaut, because jumping ahead in the eschatology here, I think the humans will someday terraform Mars. I don't think it'll happen before the Lord's return, but I think that's another reason that Jesus has made these other planets for us. They are space. They are vacant lots for us to build there someday in wisdom, and with his encouragement, and then hopefully also with some resurrection upgrades to withstand radiation when we are immortal. I think there's no reason not to suppose that the glory of the Lord that fills the earth as the waters cover the sea will not someday also expand outward into outer space, and then will not be bringing our sins with us or our mortality with us. We will be resurrected saints who are doing all of this space exploration for God's glory, not just on Mars, not just in the planets of our solar system, but beyond. Next on Fantastical Truth, there are still some worlds to explore that we can't see with the naked eye or with telescopes. One of them is the world of our next author guest. What if you woke up in a crumbling mountain castle with the beast of your nightmares? That should sound familiar. Then you discovered that the kindly dragon with you is kind, and he speaks like a man, and he reads books. Whether literary or not, how would such a dragon, the mascot of traditional fantasy, fare in a battle against spaceships? Well, that is not in the next book that we will feature, but I thought it'd be fun to ask this burning question behind next week's book battle between myself and our next guest, author Rochelle Nelson, author of the upcoming Enclave Publishing release, Ember Gold. Whether you love fantasy, whether you love science fiction, or you love a story that combines the best of both, our mission at Lorehaven is to help you explore these stories for God's glory. So let's see Mars, let's see fantasy worlds, whether or not they align with our scientific knowledge today. Let us see them in light of the knowledge that God has given us first in his word. Don't separate out the science and the wonder from the truth of the gospel. I think that it's even better to look at the night skies, as Zach quoted earlier, and wonder why God cares for humans so much to give us these gifts of real worlds in our skies that fuel our imaginations as we continue to seek and find Christ's fantastical truth.